represents the entire darkness of that dreadful.
One of the main themes of current politics is the style
remember that for women, man is a straight choice. And this hasn't really been an issue for that much. We've been together, so I felt that it was something to bring up.
Quotation 10, the last quotation. So, in wanting to be the one that one is, this is making a decision. It's making an ontic existential decision, right, to be the one that one is. Heidegger says, when Dasein understandingly lets itself be called forth to this possibility, this includes its becoming free for the call, its readiness for the potentiality of getting appealed to. In understanding the call, Dasein is in thrall to its own most possibility of existence. It has chosen itself. It's chosen itself. And the last quote. Wanting to have a conscience is rather the most primordial existential ontic presupposition for the possibility of factically coming to owe something. Factically coming to be in debt, right? Something which the graduate students here, I'm sure, are very familiar. In understanding the call, Dasein lets its own most self take action in itself. That's the phrase, take action in itself, in sich handeln, in terms of that potentiality for being which it has chosen. Only so can it be answerable or responsible, verantwortlich. Heavy word, right? What's the thought here? Responsibility, answerability, originary ethics. Well, how do we want to finesse that? Let's just say responsibility, answerability. Consists in understanding the call, in wanting to have a conscience. And this choice, Dasein's choice of itself, is taking action in itself, in sich handeln, which reminds us of a phrase of Heidegger's of a later vintage, which of course runs in the following way, which you all know. We are still far from pondering the essence of action decisively. It is a word, action, that Heidegger both uses and continually reminds us that he wants to avoid using. I mean, being in time, as Derrida has shown masterfully, and Derrida is, let's just remember, the best reader of Heidegger that we have, just in case we overlook that fact. The logic of Heidegger's avoidances is crucial here, right? It's a word that he avoids and uses. What might action mean, conceived of in relation to the double nullity that we've described? What might action mean? What might potentiality for being mean when its condition of possibility and impossibility is a double impotentialization? What might action mean in such circumstances? To perhaps anticipate another talk, such a conception of action might be called tragic. Might be called tragic. Introduction to Metaphysics would be a way of thinking that. The reading of Oedipus and Oedipus Rex and Antigone. I prefer to call it tragicomic. As one of Beckett's gallery of moribunds, Beckett, 3 lines out. As one of Beckett's gallery of moribunds, Molloy asks himself, tongue deep in his cheek, from where did I get this access of vigor? From my weakness, perhaps. And
Simon, where's home?
where's home?
You described Unheimlicher, the structures of Unheimlicher in the double. I mean, in other words, there's an emphasis on the not, I don't want to say pathological, but it's not tragic, it's traumatic, what you're describing. You're describing an existence that is tortured, between the two nullities. Mm-hmm. And my question, like Richard's, is where's it's not just Unheimlicher, it implies that there's got to be a home somewhere. There is a place where we can live and dwell and be, that is not necessarily traumatic.
Yeah, that's life with Das Mann. That's what
so
we
it's
have
got
to.
So only on authenticity.
That's the canny, right? That's the
So
familiar.
there's no possibility for living outside of trauma.
No, but that's what we do. Heidegger's point is that's what we do all the time. We live completely fascinated by this world that we share with others. Which is indeed relational, rich, and meaningful.
Yeah, Heidegger kind of implies it's a fool's paradise. The one.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I take seriously the claim. Seriously the claim that it's not making a moral valuation here. Inauthenticity is not bad. Inauthenticity is a way of being. And people have seen through that for 70, 80 years in a sort of knowing, wry way, wave their copies of Adorno and the rest at that point. But if we really take it seriously, we would then say, well, inauthenticity is where we are, that's home, right? That's not going to go away. Authenticity is just the wanting to want the want that one is. One sees that for the nullity that it is, and one for a moment can pull away from it. Master the everyday, Heidegger, but never extinguish it. We go back to it. So that's, you could say that's the cave as well. That's Heidegger doesn't think cave.
Strangers at the edge. Well, where else would they be? The edge is their place, or rather their non-place, since the edge is no place to be comfortable, to be identified, to have the status of a citizen. Yet paradoxically, the edge is also where strangers are received. It is where hospitality happens. It is the non-place where the opening of hospitable place, a place called home, country, people, in short, archetypal place itself, emerges, and where, deepened and prolonged, such place comes to stay, to last as the reliable scene and setting of hospitality. As hospitality itself, I shall suggest, considering that there is no hospitality in an edgeless place like the middle of a desert. Hospitality at the edge, hospitality on the edge, hospitality as edge. That's where I want to go this morning. Stranger's Gate. These words are chiseled in red sandstone on the wall next to an entrance to the west side of Central Park on 105th Street, close to where I now live. Every major gate to Central Park has its own name. Other names, some 12 in all by my count, are more predictable and reassuring, names such as Citizens Gate and Warriors Gate. But Strangers Gate is enigmatic. The first time I saw it walking briskly by, I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it in disbelief. I wondered what it was meant to mean when it was constructed in the late 19th century. I still do not know. My best guess is that it refers to all who come to New York as foreigners, as immigrants especially, but also increasingly as tourists and visitors. Any non-native is in effect a stranger, above all in this city with its outsized buildings and high population density, its brazen wealth chock-a-block with unalleviated poverty. Manhattan with its multilingualism and intense energies. No one feels entirely at home in New York, not even native New Yorkers, whoever these may be. Only Aboriginal Native Americans could rightly declare this place as home, but they are present only as absent, nameless, not even a memory at this late historical point, only bones encountered by chance as sewer lines are newly dug. Historians of the city may refer to them with accuracy and authority, but the rest of us, latecomers, have not the slightest clue. The most that residents of the city know now is that waves of immigrants have swept through the city from the 17th century to the present, the Dutch and the British, some Germans and French, African Americans and Irish, who, together, lived in shanty towns in Central Park when it was nothing but an open plain north of the heart of the city. Then tides of Eastern Europeans in the late 19th century, many Southerners and Midwesterners in the early 20th century, thousands of Chinese and fewer Japanese, and more recently, economic and political refugees from Central America, especially Mexico. All of these were strangers initially, and many remain so, especially those who find employment only by doing the most menial of tasks. It is most often undocumented Mexicans who are bussing tables and washing dishes these days in New York restaurants. Just look around. All of these peoples came as strangers in the night, and those who stayed became strangers in the day.
Thank you for your paper. This actually made some sense to me also about the way that you use Derrida's account of hospitality. I like the way that you use the gate as a metaphor, and I want to try to press the limits of that a little bit. My own concerns are, well, I mean, I am one of Richard's students, so I am kind of recurring on one hand, and on the other hand, I try to do work in Latin American studies. So, for me as a person of mixed identity, what I found somewhat troubling about the metaphor is that it tended to externalize or put the limits of hospitality on the outside. And as I recall so many of my own family in Mexico and how they act about things, there's a mixed heritage in Mexico, particularly with the legacy of Spain and post-colonialism. And there's a real way in which most Mexicans, particularly, are mestizo, as I myself am. And there's a need then in which you need, for one, to understand a kind of strangeness along the Christadian line as internal, how hospitality is something not directed only to people outside and away from us, but something equally directed towards the inside.
Yes.
And I'm not too sure how the gate metaphor really addressed these things at all, but the spatial dimensions of it seemed entirely to be of another kind, and I wondered if this account wasn't consumed by the metaphor that you took out.
Yeah, I mean, a number of you now have been questioning this. I mean, that's where I started, and so it's true. I kind of beat it to death, as philosophers tend to do, whenever they pick up concept or word. Yeah, maybe this is the limit of it. I don't know what to say. I mean, there aren't a lot of philosophical reflections on gates, so that's where I decided to go, part because it hadn't been done. Not even Derrida goes there, so I just thought, well, let's go with gate for this talk. But maybe I went too far. I don't know. Maybe there is a limit. I love your notion of an internal hospitality. Of course, I did rather externalize, and that's part of my general point about why the issue of hospitality has come up in recent years. As part of the general tendency that David Wood calls exteriorizing toward the fractal edge of things. You're about to hear this, and I think it's part of that.
First section, the name of God. God is trouble. The name of God is the name of trouble, the name of a disturbance. It solicits us and visits itself upon us like an uninvited stranger knocking at our door. It is a provocation and an interruption, venerable but dangerous, healing but quite poisonous, grounding but no less destabilizing, an ancient archaic but very anarchical. From of old, it has perplexed us and driven us quite mad, with love and justice, with passion and rage, with madness of almost every kind. It gives the urge to kill, or to risk being killed, a perfect alibi. The ambiguity and undecidable are not accidental, not a simple slip or fault in an otherwise pure essence that can be cleaned up and eliminated. They are constitutive, built right in, because the name of God is the name of a limit state, an extremity, the name in which we are driven to an extreme, our faculties stretched beyond themselves, beyond the possible, to the impossible. The people of God are, for better or worse, impossible people. people with a taste for the impossible, with a taste for the worst, violence, and for the most radical peace.
I really like your God as trouble, and it's the only kind of God that I can deal with. But when I was listening, I was thinking, what about, I mean, this then becomes a serious question. What about the God who offers hope in the middle of hopelessness, who isn't trouble, but the possibility of being saved or being helped or being relieved from suffering? I mean, why? How does the God of trouble fit in with that God?
As the danger supplement, I mean, it's the pharmacological structure of the idea of God. It's that every promise is a threat. Every hope is fear. And they're interwoven in such a way that you can't simply extricate them, and there is no program to decide the difference. And so the passionate commitment that the name of God evokes, and the promise of hope and justice, is always on the edge of spilling blood. And you can't sanitize it. You can't have the one without the other. It's structurally almost identical, I would say, to the passion of politics, which is always on the edge of spilling blood, and which drives people with equal earnestness to extreme opposite positions and to the point of endangering each other. The name of God's like that. It's one of those limit names. It's one of the names that drives us to the extreme. And there are other names. I'm not trying to privilege the name of God. The theology privileges the name of God because that's what it is. But there would be other names that function like that. Like the name of justice or the name of love. They're pharmacons. They're drugs. They poison and they heal.
I'm not from this country, and I came here about 14 years ago. And like everyone, trying to figure out who I am. I'm a bit of a stranger to myself, like all of us. And I was reminded of, just while Ed was talking, of Sartre's description in Saint-Genet of Genet trying to figure out who he was in this, I guess, orphanage. And he's reaching for a cookie, the top shelf, and I guess the boss comes in, the matron, and says, Genet, you're a thief. And he's so excited because he didn't know who he was. And now he knows he's a thief. Well, I was actually on the Mexican border. It's like 16 miles from the border, just outside El Paso a few years ago, driving along, and this police car stopped me and my kids and demanded my driving license and so on. I hadn't shaved for a while, but I looked pretty white. And so he took my driving license and he sort of put it through his stuff, and he said to me, he came back as a big guy, big hat, cigar. He says, "You're an alien." And I thought, that really helps. I was looking for something to hold on to, like Genet and the thief. Now I know who I am. So I was very grateful to that guy. But I was thinking about, Richard inviting me here, and Richard being from another country, not from England. Is that right? From. And here we are. He invited me. He's an alien, inviting me, a resident, an alien. I'm not sure whether alien resident or resident alien, to come to Boston, where we had that little misunderstanding with tea a while back. And I'm thinking, how do we deconstruct this extraordinary kind of role and complex here, where you have, as you were, a guest, Richard's a guest. We can be kicked out. One small felony and we're out of here. You know that? I mean, straight out. So I won't tell them. Now, you know, a guest inviting a guest. So this whole thing really is all tied up with hospitality from the beginning. Now, sun worship be a profound practice of meditation on the deep significance of the sun and all things solar. And there's more to come. When we look at the sun, it's true. The sun does not look back. This gives us a certain assurance of privilege. And yet, think about our eyes. What are they? They're the evolutionary product of living on an earth flooded with light for millions of years. These things I call my eyes spring from the sun, as does every animate organism. What looks at the sun is a child of sunlight. This is true of me as a living being and of my eyes, as essentially attuned to the sun and the visibility it opens up. Now, it's easy for phenomenologists to think of the constitutive in a formal way or a transcendental way, but it's importantly material and historical. The event of reversal or fracture is one in which the eye or I that sees the God or the sun comes to grasp it further as the condition of its own capacity to see at all, indeed to be at all. We may confidently surmise that this is an event with legs, one that ushers in further developments. Such a dependency has what I call terexistential implications. What would it be like to welcome such a revelation, or to refuse it? What would it be, as Nietzsche asked with regard to eternal return, to will it? Consider for a moment one of the deepest and most difficult aspects of this dependency, our being tied up in an unthinkably deep past. The time of evolution, of life, of animal life, of human life, is unthinkably deep. Both because it exceeds our capacity to imagine, just in terms of scale, raising really interesting questions about what those limits are and what we mean by imagine. Can we imagine the Big Bang? I just pause so that you can do that. Or the end of the world. Imagine the end of the world. But beyond the question of magnitude, we must also imagine our not being here, and indeed there being nothing like us on the planet, either at the beginning or the end. We have to peer back an interminably long way around the evolutionary corners that block illumination from the distant past. But exploring the temporal aspects of our dependency on the sun has only just begun. A meditation on this opening soon realizes that our entire fossil fuel economy and way of life consists in releasing at an accelerating rate the reserves of solar energy locked up in gas, oil, and coal, burning it like there's no tomorrow. We're tapping our stored solar past as well as drinking in today's light and heat. Moreover, we know that one day the sun will explode and the experiment will come to an end. That's not a philosophical claim, that's just a bit of science. The second example, starting after the sun, is the non-human animal. I mentioned Lawrence's poem, The Snake, in which he laments his reactive violence, throwing a stick at the snake. You should also think of Aldo Leopold's account of the light in the dying wolf's eyes, or Rothko's basking lizard to whom he says the stone terrace belongs. The movement, the reversal, the transformation is one in which the animal moves from being a part of my world, our world, to making a claim, to occasioning, on my part, the recognition the animal too, in some sense, has a world, projects significant dwelling. Some such experience happens when I pick up a worm crossing the path after a rain and deposit it safely on the other side. I recognize both vulnerability and something of a manner of life or way of dwelling on the part of the worm. In modest fashion, I go out of my way, as we say, to help him on his way.
To consider, to be responsive to the beauty of the world, must entail vulnerability to beauty and ugliness both. Or, to invoke Rilke again, lament arises only in the space of praise. We hear praise and we voice it in the double call of attentiveness. But in this synesthetic space, too, our mourning may arise, and sometimes must. We mourn where we might have rejoiced, where the promise is lost or forestalled or destroyed. If we are insensitive to beauty and to joy, then the call of destitution is at best a Kantian burden of duty. If we are insensitive to woundedness and destitution, then the call of beauty is a frivolous aestheticism. We are drawn both to the work of caring for the other and to the joy of careful attention. It is in this doubleness of care and delight that we find ourselves return to beauty as the sign of the promise, but always and only in dispossession, in the strangeness of what rises up, that divine discerning of the flesh, of the body as unique bearer of speech, the very sight of any response to the appeal. The efforts to disentangle beauty and destitution, enticement and fear, joy and sorrow, are also our efforts to tidy the sacramental promise back into a contract, fulfilled and finalized and kept, to read simple signs that inform us of a clearly defined divine entity, ideally one in which power is neatly divorced from vulnerability, when we can praise without lament. Much of Christianity does just this, but it thus takes the sacramental firmly out of the world, thus rendering the promise unsigned, the word invisible. If we want to remain in the world, that is, if we want any sense of the sacramental, we are recalled to attention. We must listen to what we see, or see, like Augustine, as if in our sight the world spoke, and we said it again. In attending to what calls, we hear the chants of hospitality. The first hospitality, says Nancy, is nothing other than listening. Nietzsche, too, links attentive listening to hospitality, writing in The Gay Science, this lengthy quotation. This is what happens to us in music. First, one has to learn to hear a figure and melody at all, to detect and distinguish it. Then, it requires some exertion and goodwill to tolerate it in spite of its strangeness, to be patient with its appearance and expression, and kind-hearted about its oddity. Finally, there comes a moment when we wait for it, when we sense that we should miss it if it were missing, and now it continues to compel and enchant us relentlessly. But that is what happens to us not only in music. That is how we have learned to love all the things we now love. In the end, we are always rewarded for our goodwill, our patience, fair-mindedness, and gentleness with what is strange. Gradually, it sheds its veil and turns out to be a new and indescribable beauty. That is its thanks for our hospitality. The end of the quotation. This is a lovely passage, but I would have to say, as one seldom does, that Nietzsche does not go quite far enough. Even here, beauty is strangeness that seduces us because we have not merely allowed, but carefully disciplined ourselves to be seduced. And we remain enraptured only while it remains a little bit strange, a little new even in the comfort of its familiarity. If we listen for the call, including the call of beauty, with the idea that we know what we will hear or what we will answer, we have not listened at all. To be listening, says Nancy, is always to be on the edge of meaning. Remaining secure in knowledge of what the world signifies, we will have no idea and no way to discern what strangeness might arise before any of our senses.
In listening to it, I found two poles that I'd like to hear you either acknowledge or deny or reconcile. One pole was that of attention, care, cultivation, all that group of terms that seem to me to be tied up with the actual, the tentative actual that's before you, around you, and so on. The other pole seemed that of possibility, not actuality, and this you tied directly to promising. In fact, you even used the phrase, promise is possible, toward the end of the talk. Now, normally, in usual ontologies, the actual and the possible seem to go different ways and diverge. So I was just imagining how those came together. They weren't really ignoring their talk. There was a tension, I thought, created between them. So now I'm asking, is it the case that sacraments and beautiful things, one or both, not necessarily both, are the means by which these two ontological modalities, the actual and the possible, are somehow held together. Ink and possibles made compossible. Or are you saying something else about them?
Okay.
Is that what's special about them? Let's say, I mean, given this analysis, if there are indeed these two poles in the paper, that at least orally, I haven't read the text, but orally.
I actually printed off copies and they're sitting over there because I forgot.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, no, it's fine. Sometimes it's better just really to listen. And so that's what I heard in my listening were these polls. And then I'm just asking you, inviting you to talk a little more about how they might live together.
Okay. I wasn't thinking of them in ontological terms, so I'm not sure how intelligent an answer I can give in those terms. But let me try starting to respond from a slightly different position and see if it works for you. I think that I would begin in a discipline of attention to the actual. And I do like the idea of a discipline of desire, of the fact that in disciplining one's desires, one can not only cut them off, but actually cultivate them and multiply and intensify them. So I was trying to suggest something of that, and that it is only in that discipline that we make for ourselves any possibility of seeing or otherwise perceiving the possible. That is, that the possible is part of what opens up for us within the actual, or even as a dimension of the actual or a perspective on it, provided that we have paid this kind of attention. Does that make sense?
A dimension, you say?
I might not have meant that.
No.
Yes. A facet might be better.
You mean the other side of the actual, or do you mean something the actual already possesses? That's intriguing.
I think that I think of it as something that the actual possesses, but it's not a way in which I have thought about it enough, so I don't want to say anything very committal. That's
okay, well, that helps. Yeah, thank you.
Most philosophical attempts to understand the role of the stranger, human or transcendent, have been limited to standard epistemological problems of the minds, metaphysical substances, body, soul, dualism, and related issues of consciousness and cognition. This seminar intends to take the question of hosting the stranger to the deeper level of embodied imagination and the senses, in the Greek sense of aesthesis. It will ask such questions as, how does the embodied imagination relate to the stranger in terms of hospitality or hostility? Given the common root of hostis that we heard allusion to this morning from Jeff, as both host and enemy. This was a study of Benveniste, with which Richard started the entire project, and indeed he insisted on the ambiguity of the word hostis and the duplicity that's involved. And my first reaction was, now there's a problem. And unfortunately, with a one-track mind, that remains the problem. And as we've passed through the intervening months, I've thought to myself, with great admiration for what's been done. It's been remarkably done. But we're just chasing shadows. You know, the real problem is that ambiguity or that ambivalence in hostis. And that has bothered me ever since, and it remains the one problem that I would like to address this evening, so that afterwards we can at least talk and say, well, at least what you said at least addressed the problem, as I understand it to you. In any case, the question comes down to, says Richard, it will ask such questions as, how does one embody the relationship to the stranger and hospitality and hostility? Okay, we've just mentioned that. We discern between projections of fear or fascination, leading to either violence or welcome, that's that ambivalence. How indeed do humans sense the dimension of the strange and the alien in different religions, arts, and cultures? And therefore we come, and how then do we deal with the perception of alterity and verticality, which operates as an affective, pre-reflective, pre-conscious level. And then we're into psychoanalysis. So I'm going to respond as best I can in the spirit of my own presence in the seminar. That's to say, to react to what seems to me the key problem and ask your help to tell me whether the problem is worth addressing and whether or not addressing it this way is of any help. Because I'm very aware of the limitations of any help that can be offered to the problem that Richard posited in the beginning. How do you explain the same word, hostis, can mean at the same time hospitality and at the same time enmity? How do you get the two together? How does that possibly make sense? That said, I tried to do my best to find some kind of, this was all audio-visual, you understand, so I was trying to find some recent audio-visual material that would pose the problem of the uncanny. Mind you, the uncanny was a title that was given to me simply because I used the word uncanny in a conversation with Richard, which I was trying to express my gratitude for something he had done very graciously for me. And he said, uncanny, that's the word, this is what you'll talk about in the seminar. So the term uncanny was not of my choosing, and I'm doing my best to make sense of having it here to talk. I tried at least to offer some visual aids to start with, and I thought to myself, now what film is there around that one would call uncanny? And I thought to myself, well, Benjamin Button would be a very uncanny type of thing. A man grown old and grows young. And then I thought to myself, but who wants to talk about Kate Blanchett as an old woman, or Brad Pitt as a squalling infant? You know, this is a fantasy of F. Scott Fitzgerald that should have been left with F. Scott Fitzgerald. At any rate, it's not an example of the uncanny. Another example that was recommended to me was this film called Moonlight, which is a film about an investigator who is basically a vampire and falls in love with his victim. Now, I thought that might be interesting, but I was told that it's the kind of film that the father of a 13-year-old girl ought to see with her father, and it would do them both good. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, that's very nice, but I've never had a 13-year-old daughter. Richard, I swear, I am not now, I have not been, I have never been the father of a 13-year-old daughter.
I didn't recommend the film, Bill.
How universal can that be? Certainly the uncanny is more universal than that. But then, a week or two ago, I woke in the middle of the night and unable to sleep. I turned on the radio and got the BBC. And they were intervening someone who had just finished a film called 50 Dead Men Walking. And this is, she was the director or the assistant to the director, and this film was about a man in flesh and blood called Martin McGartland. Now that's his real name. Martin McGartland had been recruited as a teenager in Belfast to become a spy for the British Army as amid the IRA. He did this, he was probably trained, and he was very successful for about 4 years. And the consolation that he got was, well, 50 men are still walking today because you paid us this service. Now, the unfortunate part was that the IRA found out about this. And they tried to make short shrift of Martin McGartland. They captured him, they tortured him almost unto death. by some quasi-miraculous way, he jumped out of a car over a bridge and fell into the water, to the river, and was able to escape. So he's alive and breathing now, ready to talk about his experience, which must have been excruciating, and has published a book upon which this film was based. Now, the director was saying what a fine job they had done in getting the picture of the troubles, as they're called, from both sides. And she indeed had engaged the confidence of people both in the IRA and the British to talk honestly about the way they felt about things. And she was very happy about the fact that the film was not tendentious. That it was a fair picture of everything, that they hoped it would do a great deal in the healing process as time went on. And as they were cutting the film, she had news over the air that the IRA had started up again by shooting a couple of policemen in Belfast. But this was last summer. And she described the feeling of saying, oh, no. She said it was an eerie feeling that we had, that doing everything we had been doing, and still the whole problem was still there rotting. And we just held up. Is this going to start up again, as was the general question? And happily, it did not start up again. Happily, for all concerned, the general public said, no, we've been that way, and we're not going back that way, happily, so far. So it seems to me now, her use of the word eerie corresponds to what I think the word uncanny really means. It's a normal symbol, synonym for the word. So I'm taking that as an example of the uncanny. And if you notice what it is, that she was working on something that was very, very carefully done, with every effort at objectivity to the extent that that's physically possible, and had succeeded, it appeared. And then this sudden news came and shattered, or seemed to shatter, because of this doom or blackness which was in her consciousness and the consciousness of everybody, that had been repressed, but hopefully gotten past, but nonetheless was real enough to really give her the shivers. And that's what I think is the uncanny. The happy phrase of Julia Kristeva is to translate the uncanny as l'étrangeté inquiétante. Not traumatisante, but a strangeness, for whatever that can mean, that is disquieting, upsetting, but it's not traumatic. Okay? It's not utterly destructive. So there's a kind of mixed knowing there. There's a knowing of this darkness, and a certain old apprehension is stirred by reason of it. And that stirring is called the uncanny. Now, that said, that's an empirical example of, I think, what I think the uncanny is. The really important sense of the word the uncanny comes from Freud, of course. Well, let us say his development of it. Freud developed this late in his career in 1919 between the pleasure principle and the ego and the id. He was at the height of his speculative powers in terms of the metapsychology that he was talking about. And he took his source from a book by the name of a man by the name of Jentsch from 1908, entitled The Psychology of the Uncanny. Now, Freud remarks the fact that it's strange that the uncanny, although we can trace the roots of it all through the history of thought, is nonetheless had not become a theme for psychological reflection until this book in 1908. And it was on the basis of that book that the article on the uncanny by Freud was written in 1919. Now, the book actually is based upon an analysis of a tale by E.T.A. Hoffmann, who wrote several tales, were put to music by Offenbach. We used to hear Offenbach's Tales of Harlem. And one of the stories is a story about a certain Nathaniel, and the gist of it is, this is called The Sandman. Now, I remember being in a home of a young family, and the boy was 5 or 6, whatever. He was allowed to stay up because company was there. And he began to yawn, and she said, oh, Sandman's coming. Sandman's coming. And he kind of smiled and realized the fact of life. And so my sense of it was a kind of a cheerful story about a Sandman. And the sense of it was that the Sandman just does come, he throws this dust in your eyes and makes you sleepy, yes, but he also makes you dream. And it's a wonderful dream, you wake up in the morning, everything will be great. So it's a fine bedtime story, except that Nathaniel asked his mother to explain it, and she said, I don't know. So she passed it on to the babysitter who was coming in, the nurse was going to take care of him. And the babysitter said, well, you know, the real story is that the Sandman comes and he takes out people's eyes. And he takes them up and he puts them in a big bag and he takes them up to his hiding place behind the half moon in the sky. And that's pretty scary stuff. So Nathaniel said, well, he was going to stay up and see what this Sandman was like, you know, and defend himself, yes, sir. And in fact, he did see, first of all, a heavy clam, though a heavy-footed person who came up after he was in bed and went in to see his father. And they closed the door and they muttered quietly and between them. And that was already suspicious. But the worst part of it was that he kept coming back night after night, always going to the father, always talking darkly, always carrying something in his sack, and heavy-footed and sort of ominous. And soon enough, the father died. My memory is that he was killed, but certainly he died. So we had this combination now of a boy wondering about his fate of his eyes, and also combined with an experience of the father's death. And he apparently got past that particular crisis, but when he got into university, he had trouble with his eyes, and went for an examination, and the trouble came again, and the old anxiety reemerged. Now that's the basis of Freud's analysis. And the substance of it was, therefore, that this would be an example of the uncanny. And Freud tells us this, after going through it in detail, and he had already gone into a long explanation of the meaning of uncanny and so forth. But what he comes down to is saying this. It's a long and careful analysis and worth reading, of course. But the heart of it is this. At this point, I will put forth two considerations which I think contain the gist of this short study. In the first place, if psychoanalytic theory is correct in maintaining that every affect belonging to an emotional impulse, whatever its kind, is transformed if it is repressed into anxiety, then among instances of frightening things, there must be one class in which the frightening element can be shown to be something repressed which recurs. So what we have here now, the repressed experience of childhood is recurring now at the occasion of a medical exam in the university. This class of frightening things would then constitute the uncanny. And it must be a matter of indifference whether what is uncanny was itself originally frightening, or whether it is carrying some other affect than simply that. In the second place, if this is indeed the secret nature of the uncanny, we can understand why linguistic usage has extended das Heimliche, the homely, into reality, nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind, and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. This reference to the factor of repression enables us furthermore to understand Schelling's definition of the uncanny as something which ought to have remained hidden but has come to light, unfortunately. This then is the structure of the uncanny as Freud sees it. There is a primal trauma of some kind which is kind of repressed, but not to the extent that it is not does not return by recall, except with any more distance than the attempt to repress it gave. In other words, it's sort of on the fringe of consciousness which is retrieved.